fleet of them. Look on the ASA.
My gosh.
They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots from the west.
Look at that thing, dude.
That's not our LNS though, is it? It's not.
That is the LNS, dude.
Well, if there's like...
Look at that thing.
It's rotating.
Hello and welcome to Out of India Theory. This is Ramesh. I hope you guys are doing well. In today's podcast, we have a very special guest. If you have seen the show on Netflix about UFOs called Encounters, you might recognize him from the first episode, Messengers. Basically, he worked as a US Naval intelligence cryptologist on board the USS Theodore Roosevelt, which recorded the now famous or infamous Gimbal UFO footage somewhere in 2015. And he's also the author of this wonderful book that I read recently. It's called Initiated: UAP, Dreams, Depression, Delusions, Shadow People, Psychosis, Sleep Paralysis, and Pandemics. Matthew Roberts, thank you so much for coming onto the channel, especially at such an early hour at 6 a.m. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Ramesh. Appreciate it.
And I have to say that's a really long subtitle on your book. And I kind of get it because I've been reading this for the last 3-4 days, and it's really dense, information dense, and packed with so much of your research and experience.
Yeah.
And I think I'm about 80% through that book, so I still haven't finished it. But of course, I watched the show and your other interviews. And so obviously no surprises for guessing. I thought we'd start the discussion from the footage itself. So what can you just explain what exactly was your involvement? Because the way I understand it, you were on board the USS Theodore Roosevelt when it recorded this UAP. Could you tell us what your role was in that entire episode? How were you involved?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I was involved so much as I just knew about what was happening. So I was a cryptologist on board the ship, and we were doing our normal workup cycle. The workup cycle had finished. We were, just sitting there kind of waiting for our grade. And a workup cycle is just where you're tested on how well you do your job. And so the whole ship was being tested, and this was a step towards the upcoming deployment. And this is a common thing that ships go through. So we were just sitting back waiting for a grade at the end of this month-long test, and a buddy of mine walked into the shop, my shop, which is a skiff on the ship. And he said, "Hey, check this out." And so I pulled it up on my computer, and we all kind of gathered around in the shop. And, we were all cryptologists or intelligence specialists. And so we're sitting there basically watching the gimbal footage. And that's of course now been released to the public, and the world has seen it now. But that was the first time we watched it, was back in 2015 on board the Theodore Roosevelt in a skiff.
Right. And was that recording, did that happen from the same day, or was it just a recording from sometime in the past?
No, it was ongoing, right? It was happening now. It was not real time, but it had happened, I think, the previous night, and we were sitting there kind of watching it. And so that's how that went. And then, for the next 4 days, obviously, there were this continued to happen. They came back every night.
Okay. Actually, I was going to ask you that. So was that like a one-off incident, or were there do these things keep happening? And I presume there's footage. Do you guys, I'm sure that there are some things you can talk about and some things you can't talk about. Of course, feel free to let us know. But is this a sort of routine to capture every anomaly that appears on in your field of view, or was that an exception?
So this was I mean, it was anomalous because it wasn't really supposed to be happening. It wasn't something I don't think anyone expected to be happening. It's just something that ended up happening. So we were sitting out there, right? And if your radar picks up something in the vicinity of the ship, you've got to find out what it is, right? And
Right.
so if they're not answering you on international hailing frequencies, which is law, it's international law that you have to monitor these frequencies if you're either another boat or an aircraft, and you have to monitor those in case someone's calling you for something, right? So if they're not responding on that frequency, they're not responding to you, you've got to launch jets to go figure out what's going on, right?
Right.
And people say, oh, well, this is probably just one of our own jets or our own tech, and it's nonsense, complete nonsense. Because if there's something in the vicinity of a warship, it is our duty to find out what is going on, right? Because in a post 9/11 world, if it's behaving oddly and it's not responding to you like it normally should in accordance with international law, that escalates really quickly, right? And then it becomes a question of, is this an airliner that's been hijacked, post 9/11?
Yeah.
So it becomes a very big deal. And so just the idea that some of these debunkers have out there of like, this was just, it was one of ours, it was misidentified, it's nonsense.
Right. Was this phenomenon observed live? Like, were there people on deck actually looking up at the sky and seeing it? Or was there any record of that? Maybe did somebody happen to pull out their phone and record it on their phone? Or would you know if...
I can't speak to that. I don't.
Okay.
I can't talk about that.
Okay. And I also read somewhere that, of course, the gimbal footage, the Theodore Roosevelt, it's on Wikipedia, is that it was stationed on the east coast of the US, like just as the Nimitz was on the west coast, and it got the Nimitz footage. And there was the other Go Fast footage, which is also from the Theodore Roosevelt, I think from the east coast. I was just thinking, because I remember reading, it's not just like one warship, but a group of warships that engage in these exercises. Would you know if all of them reported it? Or if what's like the protocol? Like, is it supposed to be lodged somewhere, or what happens in these cases officially?
Well, I don't know that. There's no like protocol for, reporting on anomalous on UAP, right? I don't think there's any. And certainly back then, there was no protocol for it. I don't know if there is now, because I'm no longer in. But, back then there was no protocol for it. So I don't know if the other ships were seeing it. I don't know. I just don't know that.
Okay. So if I have to summarize, so we know that these things have been appearing in the sky. So it's possible that there have been other, of course, there's been repetitive visitations, and there could be more footage out there that we don't know. But so eventually this turned out like this. But was there? Do you know if there was any interaction between the ship and the anomalous object and the ship in terms of some kind of did it respond to the USS Theodore Roosevelt in some way, or was it just like a neutral show?
I don't think I'm going to answer that question.
Okay. So then I'd probably just go to how you felt, because I remember reading the book that you said you felt you had this emotional reaction to this footage.
Mm-hmm.
And you kept viewing it over and over and again, and then you couldn't, did you at all discuss it with your teammates, your colleagues, and did anybody else have a similar reaction to it?
Yeah, I did. We did talk about it a little bit, because obviously we all gathered around and kind of watched the footage. But like I said, I had kind of an emotional reaction to it that at the time I didn't understand.
Right.
It was just kind of out of nowhere, right? But no one else was having that reaction. No one else. And in fact, like I would go back and, we subsequently after that, we left on deployment. And I would watch this. I would sit there at my desk and watch this footage like just over and over again, kind of trying to make sense of what I was seeing, right?
Right.
And it didn't make sense to me. And so, I mean, it was to the point I was so obsessed with it that I mean, I was also watching, the Go Fast footage because they were both from the same incident. And some of my guys walked into the shop behind me and, they looked at my computer screen. They're just like, are you watching that again? Like, what are you doing? And so nobody was having this reaction to it. And I just kind of looked at them and I was like, how do you not think that this is like the most incredible thing you've ever seen, right? I mean, it's totally anomalous. What is it? Who is it? It was
Right.
it was strange, right?
But if I have to be very specific about your reaction, like I imagine if, for example, if I saw a light here in front of me, like a ball or an orb, I would be overwhelmed and I would be in awe of it. And if of course, I wouldn't blame you for looking back, looking at the footage again and again. I would do the same, I guess. Mm-hmm. But when you say you felt emotional, to me, I kind of understood as like an overwhelming feeling where you like this feelings well up and you cry. Is that because of some kind of a recognition of something that's hidden deep inside, or was it just the awe of watching something anomalous? Like or was it fear?
No, I think that it was. I think looking back, it was definitely something welling up deep inside, right? It had something to do with. It has to do with the subconscious. And so I subconsciously felt that, right? And it didn't something felt off. Something wasn't right. And so I had this incredibly emotional reaction to it. I even got this like deep feeling that they were there for me and that somebody was going to find that out. And that would not be good for me. And I thought like it just would not, I couldn't shake this feeling, right? And I was incredibly paranoid about it at the time. And I kind of tried to just put it out of my head because how ridiculous is that thought, right? It doesn't make any sense. And so there was that. I was having that kind of reaction to it, and it was terrifying to be having
Right.
that reaction. So it was just kind of it was like an emotional roller coaster with it, right? But like I said, nobody else that I knew of was having this reaction to it.
Right. And if I may ask, was this personally for you, was this the first time something like this happened to you, or have you had experiences like this where you've seen stuff in the sky or heard about it, or any kind of a close encounter with some kind of unexplainable UAP or lights, or was it the first time in your life that you can remember?
At the time I thought it was the first time in my life, right? But in retrospect, kind of looking back, there were weird things that happened. Like there was one day I was just at home, right? And my dog needed to go out, needed to go potty in the backyard. So I took him out there, right? And I'm standing there, kind of looking around, and then I see this black, looks like a lump of coal, like just kind of floating through the sky above my house, right? And I'm looking
Was
at
it
it.
like really far away or very close at like a
I
tree
couldn't
level?
I couldn't even tell, but I was looking at it, and then the shape was just nonsense, right? And it was just floating across the sky. And I thought to myself, well, that's strange. It must be some kind of plastic bag floating through the air. I don't know, but looking back, I'm like, I think that was something, you know.
Swamp gas or Venus or meteorite?
Right, exactly. Right, yeah. I don't, looking back on it, I don't think it was a plastic bag. I think it was a little
Okay,
bit farther away, and I think it was probably about the size of a city bus, you know. Um,
right. Okay, and this is where I think like the story and the discussion gets interesting, because something that is like out there in the world and solid and public suddenly becomes a very personal experience, which you have of course channeled through this book. And I was reading your book, I found it very fascinating. If I just sort of lay out three sections on the table, there was this event followed by your personal like medical emergency. I mean, let me know if it's okay to talk about it. If you don't want to talk about it, it's fine. It's just that you had this pulmonary embolism and you were in the being operated on, and then of course these sequence of mysterious events happen. How were they connected? I mean, was it connected? Do you think this event of this thing appearing and you looking at it and triggering emotions, did that have anything to do with your health emergency one? And then from there, did it like sort of lead a sort of cascade into all these other experiences, or was it just a catalyst for something that's been sort of simmering underneath all along?
I think it was a catalyst for something that's been simmering underneath for all along, but I will say that I think the medical emergency was definitely a part of this. Even though it happened kind of before everything started to happen. I kind of view that medical emergency as the start, right? That's kind of what kicked everything off, which is why I included it in the book.
Right.
And in it's kind of strange because I had this medical emergency, but later on in my experience, as I explained later in the book, that I was kind of shown what happened that night, right? Where I basically died, right? And they intervened, and so that was like, I was like, no way. But they showed me that, and I just kind of had to accept it. Um,
Right.
and and so I do view that as something that's very much linked with this. Yeah.
And reading, judging by the experiences you describe in your book, it's to me, at least at first, it didn't strike us this sort of a classic alien abduction template, like where there's nuts and bolts craft lands, people lose consciousness, and then they wake up and find themselves on a table, and then like there are implants, and then they're told that they're from another galaxy, and and then there's this mandatory general advice about how humanity is wrecking Earth and how we need to be careful and things like that. But from what I understand, yours took a slightly more like a spiritual turn, and it wasn't exactly a nuts and bolts experience. And to me, it sort of falls into this sort of a twilight zone, a little bit like Skinwalker Ranch, where it's not exactly just aliens and UFOs, but it goes into sort of this ghostly, like ethereal beings appearing. It takes almost a spiritual hue, right? It falls under a different category almost. So, but the first question, I guess, is: did you have the regular kind of an abduction experience also, or do you think the nature of the phenomenon itself is like this, and it
I,
depends on
I
who's experiencing it?
Right. I really think that the experience I had is actually the experience that everybody has. But they totally misinterpret at every step what exactly is happening to them. And I view this experience as something that is very ancient. It is the root of all the world's religions, whether they're living or dead. I can see that very clearly from my standpoint. But I think that, here, especially here in the U.S., we don't really teach philosophy or any kind of spiritual teachings. We're very much STEM related, and if it
Right.
doesn't fall into the realm of something that is provable by science, then it just doesn't exist. Right? And
Right.
because people don't have this perspective on things, they totally miss the point of what is happening within their experience. And for example, I can see within my own experience, and the way that I describe it is something that these are touch points that happen in every experience with everyone, right? But what happens is there's this, kind of lore within the U.S. when it comes to ufology that it's just UFOs. They're aliens. They're from another planet, and it's as simple as that. And it is not that simple at all, because my viewpoint is that they're from here, right? And that they have
Right.
always been here. They've been here longer than we have. And in fact, I think that that's what they're doing here. They're kind of, rearing the human race to be just like them, right? Parents, for example.
Right.
And so I feel like, as Americans, we're just missing this perspective of philosophy and things that would actually explain this experience. Philosophy and religious studies, right? That's what we're missing. But, in the U.S., we think that this is all nonsense. And the thing that I always say to people who tell me that, STEM is where it's at, right? That's what we have to be teaching in school. Well, I always say to people like that, Plato, he had his best student, right? And his best student and that student's best student was Alexander the Great, right? And these are philosophers. And
Right.
Alexander the Great conquered most of the known world within his lifetime. And so this is powerful stuff. I mean, show me the last time someone with a STEM degree conquered most of the known world, right? It's never happened. And it never
Right.
will happen. Because what philosophy does is it speaks to something greater, right? Something that lies deep within us. And when you can speak to that, you can move people to do anything, right? So philosophy and religious studies, it's very powerful stuff. And it should not be ignored at all. I mean, that's where you're going to find the answers to what's going on ultimately.
Right. So this is very interesting to me personally, because this is a subject that I've been interested in for a long time. And in a way, my own views have sort of evolved over the period of last decade or so to sort of come closer to this view, because I began looking at ufology as these, crafts landing from another planet, these nuts and bolts. Maybe there's a little component of that when it sort of manifests in our 3D world. But overall, I think the real nature of this is somehow it sort of interacts not with the objects, but with our consciousness, right? And I found that fascinating that you sort of seem to arrive at the same conclusion through your experiences. But I just want to be the devil's advocate here just for a little bit. And these were some of the criticisms that I read online as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you speak of these beings appearing to you at night when you're, in either sleeping or when you've just woken up, the classic hypnopompic state or the hypnagogic state, just the state. People usually say it's just sleep paralysis, and if you've been through a stressful situation, it's not uncommon. People have been known to observe beings.
Right.
Does it mean that all cases of sleep paralysis where these beings appear are this, or like how does it, like, was your case special? Like how would you rationalize that, if at all?
The way I would rationalize that is exactly what I was just talking about, right? So we science wants to totally dismiss it, right, and say it's just sleep paralysis, it's some malfunction of the brain, and there's nothing to it, right? But I think that people who experience this, they kind of know that there's something else going on there. But unfortunately, there are people, though, who experience sleep paralysis, and they try to deny it, right? They try to explain it away as some, malfunction of the brain. But I think that whenever this happens, it is some kind of intervention in terms of consciousness, right? It all comes back to consciousness. And so something is tapping in and trying to get your attention. And it's up to you whether you want to give it to them or not, right? And if you don't, well, then it'll eventually just go away, right? Because you're not responding to it, or you're not responding appropriately to it.
Right.
But I think that's what's going on. I think all instances of sleep paralysis are something like that, some kind of a consciousness, somebody poking you on the shoulder saying, hey, wake up.
But when you say they, like when you refer to these apparitions of beings, can we sort of, I know sometimes words are inadequate because it kind of falls out of the three-dimensional world, and words become inadequate to something description is. But if we have to approximate who is they, what are they? Are they like beings on Earth at a different plane? Are they gods? Are they deities? Are they demons? Are they humans from the future? Like when you say they and they're already here, what do you mean? Like what does it mean for you?
I think it's kind of it's all of the above. I mean, except I don't like the humans from the future idea, and the only reason I don't like that is because when you put it in that context, right, there's this automatic human need to try to anthropomorphize this, right, to make it human. And so if you just say, oh, it's just us from the future, then you assume it's us with the same level of consciousness. Maybe our bodies have changed and evolved, but our minds and everything are still the same. And that's not the case with what's intervening here, right? What is intervening here is very much not going to fit in that anthropomorphic box. So don't describe it as future humans, because you could almost say that even if it is us, it is so changed and far removed from us that it's like comparing us to a fish, right? The consciousness level there is not the same at all.
Right.
And so it's so far removed at this point that it's really not us, right? I mean, does that make sense?
Kind of, yeah. I guess in a way, like the way I deal with it when I ponder on subjects like this is like this little model that I made for myself is that like I look at the spectrum of life on Earth as we know it, and traditional science thinks that at the lowest end of the spectrum are these single-celled organisms and bacteria and germs and everything, which are supposed to be like, very rudimentary and without any intelligence. And then we sort of assume that we are at the apex, at the other end of the spectrum. We are it. But then I've come to realize, especially growing up in India in a very traditional religious, well, Hindu background, which is more accommodating of these more fantastic worlds with other beings than, say, a secular Western world. I believe that we are actually not at the end of this spectrum here, but somewhere in the middle or even lower down. And there are beings far ahead of us in evolution in various forms. And there is no way for me to prove this, but I believe that consciousness need not be embodied. It doesn't have to be in a solid matter, and you could have a blob of consciousness. Maybe if you, and this is where I guess the Kabbalion that you read and all the other religious spiritual texts come into being, where everybody talks of the universe or reality as vibration, and a series of increasing frequency where different sort of worlds reside. And depending on like a radio, whichever level you're tuned in, you're like locked into that reality. But if you are able to sort of loosen and disengage and rise higher through whatever spiritual pursuit, maybe you can access those higher realities and see those forms which are not of this flesh and blood. Well, I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but I guess it's sort of this model I feel explains to me, it sort of helps me sort of cross all the troubling questions, how are they able to travel faster than light, come from so far away and things like this. But then would you agree with this kind of a model? Is that what you have in your mind when you...
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that that's very much true. I think that it's not something that is necessarily embodied. I mean, it can be. I don't think it has to be. And I think that that's the whole idea of like dreaming. Like, where do you go when you're asleep, right? And what are you doing?
Right.
Because I've certainly, and I detail this experience in my book where I'm taught things in dreams, right? And I'll be shown something that I had no idea about, and then I can wake up and go to Google and look it up and see that, oh yeah, that actually is a thing, right? And I didn't know about that before.
Right.
And I don't know how else you explain that. Other than that, consciousness and all of this stuff really is not what science would have us believe it is. It's much more than that. And
right.
just because there's a majority of people that don't have any experience with that doesn't mean that it's not happening, right? I mean,
Right.
people deny this, and they will deny it, kind of viciously even. But that doesn't mean that you're right about it at all. And so I think it's really important to kind of just step back and ask these big questions and figure out, people are experiencing something. So what is that? What are people experiencing? And I don't think that that's something that we have to get angry. Those aren't questions that we have to get angry about. But a lot of people do and will for some reason.
But do you think that denying, like for somebody who's so locked into this world of objects and three-dimensional world and rationality and, reductive science, by denying and not believing in it, so it's like these experiences and these worlds are just outside the threshold of your immediate perception. It's like almost they're knocking on your door, but just by not believing in it, they don't see it. Is that how it is? The moment you believe it and you allow it, they'll start experiencing this as well. Would you agree? But then there's what if they start deluding themselves and imagining things?
Yeah, I mean, I think believing in it is certainly a part of that, but I don't think that is the only component that goes into this. At all. I think that there are a lot of things that go into this, and the thing that I look at is Jungian psychology, and archetypes and things like that, and the subconscious, and I think that all of that plays into this in various different ways. It's very complex. And there are very few people who have any understanding of it because we don't ask these big questions. But I think that I guess I don't know. Does that answer your question? I mean, I think that I like there's more that goes into it. There's things like empathy that kind of play a role in it.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, I guess it kind of falls in the vicinity of what I was looking at. Because the moment I said, I asked my question about belief, then I realized there are so many people out there who never believed or expected this experience and still got them. So maybe
right,
I'm not 100% accurate when I talk about belief. But then I'd still go back and make a point on the appearance of these creatures, because
right,
of course there's your experience where these beings appeared in forms of light and tall beings and short gnome like beings and blue beings and so on. Traditionally, a lot of people describe a fixed form, I mean, among other morphologies, of gray aliens who capture them, and there seems to be some kind of a uniformity there. Do you think, how does that arise? Is it does it fall into the same category, these forces manifesting as these? Why is there uniformity in their description of these gray beings? Is it just a cultural indoctrination that they expect to see it?
I don't know because I never saw anything that I would categorize as a gray. Um, that's not to say that that's not an aspect of this. Uh, because there are people who have talked about experiencers have talked about seeing these gnome-like beings. I've heard subsequent to my own experience people talking about this, and also blue-skinned beings and some of the other ones that I saw. I mean, so I don't know. Just because I didn't see anything that I would describe as a traditional gray, I wouldn't say that that doesn't mean that it's not a part of this. I think it is. Um,
Right.
but I mean, I don't know. I don't know where that fits in. I don't know.
Right. Have you ever, maybe it was in your book and I missed it, I don't know, but have you ever considered done like a hypnotic regression session which takes you back into the recesses of your subconscious to see what's coming up, like maybe some hidden, buried experiences?
No, no, I've never, I've never done the regression thing, and the reason why I've never done that is because I feel like there's a lot of um, just kind of, and I know I'm gonna offend people here, but I don't really care because there's a lot of nonsense that comes out of some stuff like regression, I think, um, because I've seen people, videos of people being regressed, and they talk about how, oh, they're telling me that they need our DNA for like, and it's like a band-aid or whatever. And that's just, it's not true. I mean, we have CRISPR technology now, which you can use to splice DNA kind of any way you want it. And so, if you look at us and our technology, and we've got that now, um, I don't think that they would have any need for that, right? I mean,
Right.
I feel like that. I feel like there's been a lot of nonsensical explanations that have come out of stuff like regression because it's so suggestive, and I don't trust it. I don't.
Have you heard of this expression, this phrase called library angel? So
Library.
apparently, the library angel. So apparently, this happens to most people, including myself, is when you have this question that's troubling you and you're seeking answers to a problem, somehow a book comes to you, a name of a book, an article or a magazine, it drops out in front of you or somebody mentions it, which is exactly what you need to read at that point. And it's happened to me a few times, and I know it happens, and I've read about people experiencing it online. But then I guess your book your experience that I read in the book was probably the first case where you have had so many library angel visiting you, because I saw your bibliography. You listed so many books which came as inspirations. You were led, one thing to the other. It's like you have a special affinity with the library angel.
Yeah.
It's almost like you got all your downloads through this mechanism
Yeah,
somehow.
I think that I think that's right. I mean, this experience, like at first it's very intense, and it wants you to look at certain things, right? And it's very much involved with you on a daily basis, but then it kind of weans you off, right? So that you can recognize how this library angel kind of is there all the time, and it's available to everybody, I believe.
Right.
But it's just it's so subtle that it's very difficult to recognize, right?
Right.
Like I describe in my book how I would, as I'm waking up from sleep, I would hear this voice. It was always the same voice. It was a female voice, and it would give me the name of an author or a book. And it would, that author or that book would then, kind of describe exactly the questions that I had in my head about what was going on at that
Right.
point in time, right? And so I came to realize that, well, it wants me to write a book, right? And so I started writing this book, and it continued, right? It would tell me, this voice would tell me what kinds of things to include in there. And there was even a point in the book where I had written I had done some research and wrote this little couple pages about the Italian Renaissance, right?
Right.
And as I'm waking up the next morning after writing this, the voice says, "Take it down. It's too pedantic," right?
I see.
And so I actually didn't even know what pedantic meant. I was like, wait, what exactly does that mean? So I had to look it up. And
So the voice is also a proofreader.
yeah, exactly. It was like, oh, it's not inspired, right? It was very kind of blah. It wasn't inspired language. It wasn't like the kind of mythopoetic thing that they want.
Right.
It was just kind of like, it was like a book report on, the Italian Renaissance, and that's not what they wanted it described as, right?
Right.
And so I had to make it more inspired, basically, and I guess it was okay with with what I ended up putting in the book. But yeah,
And how long did it take you to write the book? Like all the research that you did and this whole chain of, looking at books after
yeah.
books after books.
I mean, I guess so. This whole thing started out. My experience is I started keeping a journal, right? Because I knew that what was happening to me was significant. I knew I needed to understand it, and I wanted to document it, right? What is happening? When is it happening? So that I could try to, make some sense of what was going on here, right? So that's what I did, and the journal kind of turned into the book, right? It helped me to write the book, and it was just kind of, I don't know, it was a very incredible experience. I'm writing another book now, currently,
Okay.
and I continue to have these kinds of experiences and dreams that show me things, or synchronicities that will point things out to me, and it's like, oh, okay, I get it. They want me to include that as well. But
Right.
again, having been through this and having connected to this consciousness in the way that I did, it will show me things that are incorrect too, right? Like it'll lead me down a path towards a book that's just nonsense, right? But it's nonsense, but it wants me to say that book is nonsense and point out why, right? Because it's a book that's, maybe very popular with people, and it's leading people in the wrong direction. and so
Right.
and so these things kind of have to be, the nuance has to be explained, and why things are the way they are. And And so the voice and these synchronicities will lead me down that kind of path.
Right. But at what point, I'm just wondering, because if people start having these experiences, seeing these beings in bed or in front of them at night or hearing voices, initially, of course, they assume that they're going crazy, right? Like it's something that's like I'm becoming schizophrenic. It's like an aspect of my own subconscious. At what point did you realize that these are not from your being, not part of your own subconscious, but literally something from outside that's impinging on your awareness? Like, are you even aware of that separation? Like it's something else that's telling me, or could it be that it's just some deep hidden aspect of your own subconscious or unconscious that is guiding you in this way?
Yeah, well, I mean, the way I kind of look at it now is that, the higher you get up on this food chain, right now, humans and science, we don't understand what the next level of evolution looks like, right? We have no idea what that looks like. But what it does look like is higher consciousness. And so the higher you go on that, the more you are kind of aware of the singular nature of everything, and the more you behave in accordance with that. So that's kind of, it's very difficult to kind of put into words, but you just kind of realize that everything is just kind of just the same thing, right? And
Right. You sort of you have an intuitive realization of the essential unity of all. It's
yeah,
like part of a spectrum.
right, yeah. And yeah, it's like a spectrum, and you can see that there are things higher up on that spectrum that obviously, because of the nature of their advancement, they are given more responsibility within this creation, right? And so they will reach down the spectrum to try and pull other things up, right? And that's their job. And so I think that's kind of what we're looking at here.
Right. Just quickly jumping into the spiritual side of this, I know of a lot of people who speak of this Galactic Federation. Like how like Earth is being overseen by these higher, like you said, these masters and higher group of beings, and there's another level above that. There's this like little hierarchy in cosmos. So do you think that's like an accurate description? Because there are these, like, this is one person for each galaxy, and then it's sort of like a little pyramid like this, which would kind of resonate more with a lot of these Eastern civilized, non-Abrahamic spiritual models, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think that well, just as I said, there is a hierarchy, right? I think that just as I said, it's all on a spectrum. There are things higher up on the
Got it.
spectrum, but I think that when you simplify it to something like, oh, it's the Galactic Federation, and you give it a name, it almost becomes cartoonish, right? And cartoonish because it's so simplified an explanation that it's fundamentally incorrect, right? And that's kind of the way I view those kinds of teachings that talk about Galactic Federation, right? Because I think that we've always called these things something. We've called them gods or demons or um, spirits or
Angels.
fairies, angels, right? We've had all these different names for them, but fundamentally it's the same thing. It's just something a little bit higher than we are on this continuum of life, right?
Right.
And so I think when you put it in terms of like, oh, it's the Galactic Federation, it's like people think of Star Wars, and that's just kind of nonsensical. I kind of I hate to say this, but how in like in like the Muslim culture, for instance, it's forbidden to depict Allah, right?
Yeah.
And it's forbidden because you don't want to put him in a box. You don't want to put that into a box because it doesn't fit in that box. And so I feel like when people describe, oh, it's the Galactic Federation, they're kind of doing the same thing. They're putting it in a box. And that's fundamentally the wrong way to think about it because in all actuality there is no box, right? Um,
Hmm.
and so it's just the wrong way of thinking about it, I feel.
What do you think is their motive? In general, what is their intention towards humanity? When I say they, of course I'm considering them as a monolith. It could be that there are, like you said, there are many different sort of gradations in this. But like, what is the general intention towards humanity, and especially speaking for yourself in your personal experience towards you? Is it to show you something or to lead you towards a certain goal or some growth path, or what do you think it is?
Well, I think that it's obviously, I think it's impossible to tell what the next step in human evolution looked like. And I think that these steps that we're taking now have to be conscious steps. You have to be consciously aware that you are taking the next step. And you
Right,
can't do that unless something is showing you the way, right? Which is initiation, right? That's why I call my book that.
right,
And this is not a new concept, right? This has been around for thousands of years. People have been talking about this. So my book is nothing revolutionary. It's just revolutionary, I think, for an American to be saying this and an American to be putting it in these terms because it's not very common here in the United States, certainly. Maybe probably in India, this kind of thing is much more accepted, than it
yeah.
is here.
Well, in India, and I would say in some Eastern countries, maybe even Japan and these Asian places, it's kind of paradoxical because there is hardly any excitement about UFOs and aliens, and it's not really a thing that's respectably looked upon. And people are like, don't really even consider this. Maybe a little bit now it's coming into public discourse because of what's happening in the West. But otherwise, it's just like sort of kept in the fringe and nobody really talks about it. At the same time, they're more tolerant and accepting of this worldview, which is more accepting of gods and beings and deities. So I feel like it's like they believe in the same thing but in a different form, and
Hmm.
the worldview sort of has this places for this to fit in. It's just there in everyday life, nobody's interested in it. You will hardly find anybody spending time looking up at the sky and wondering, oh, what is that light, or what is this? And so a lot of people ask me actually based on my podcast, like, why do aliens only come to the US? Why is it such a Western thing? And I tell them it's more of a reporting deficit. Like if you look up, you'll see them everywhere. Have you ever felt any malevolence or a negative force or sort of evil force, or has it all been good and light and love?
No, it has not been all good and light and love, but I think that that's the point, right? Because I think that what they're doing is they are, in a way, because they're contacting us through these kind of subconscious channels, which we are unaware of as humans for the most part. We have feelings that we describe as intuition or a gut feeling, right? And we don't really know what that is or where it comes
Hmm.
from, but we know it is, right? Science that hasn't explained it, certainly. But I think that those ultimately what it's doing is it's getting us to explore that, right? It's getting us to explore that subconscious and figure it out. And because it's coming through that direction, it's kind of pushing through all of these bad things that kind of lie within it. And so
Right.
we will experience those as emotion. We'll experience, fear and anger and angst and it'll just feel like the worst thing in the world. But kind of in retrospect, someone would look at that and say, well, that's malevolent, right? That's evil.
Right.
But I of course don't feel that way. I think that it just makes people uncomfortable, and when people are uncomfortable, they automatically assume that's a bad thing. But that's a part of growth, right? We know that. Psychologically, some of the worst things that you have been through in your life have taught you the most about yourself, right?
Right.
I mean,
Right.
that's not a mystery. Everybody knows that. And when you're in that bad thing, it seems awful. But when you come out of it and you're stronger, it's like, oh, you know, even though that was like the most difficult thing and it was awful, I kind of feel like I'm a better person for it, you know? And so is that malevolent? I don't think so, right? We see in nature that, you know, before there can be any new growth in anything, kind of the old has to die out and be burned away, and then something else, something new grows, right? And so
Right.
our own psyche is no different than the physical world, than those kinds of same themes that happen in the physical world, because everything is ultimately, like I said, one thing. And so the themes you see playing out in nature are also playing out in your own mind. And you just need to realize that. Just because something is bad doesn't mean that you're not going to be better for it. And so maybe don't think about it as the worst thing ever when you're going through it. Maybe try to learn
Right.
from it, right?
So this makes sense, but one question that immediately popped into my head is related to aliens and UFOs and everything, but probably doesn't exactly fit into this universe that we just described. Is, for example, cattle mutilations. Like there are so many, or probably non-consensual experimentation or abduction of people and things like that. If you look at the traditional model of aliens, I
Right.
mean, people have seen like animals dead and sort of negative consequences coming out of this thing. Is that at all something you'll be able to explain or ponder? Like, are there beings which genuinely sort of prey on lower forms to gain from it? Not everybody's intention is altruistic in that sense.
Right. And I will say that and this is why I don't believe that, right? And not necessarily that I don't believe in cattle mutilation, like, or animal mutilations by higher forces, but I think that and it's a very complex idea, kind of where I've arrived on this. When I came into this higher consciousness, right, and I could kind of explore that, I realized that the second I had kind of a thought that was anything other than creative in a positive way, right? Purely creative, because this is a creation, and we are created to create creation,
Right.
by the way. The second I thought something, I guess you could say, impure, right? I was sitting at my desk, and I was at work, and somebody came and asked the woman in the cubicle next to me a question. She didn't like the question, and she kind of threw a fit, right? And it was dead quiet, right? Everybody's just working in their cubicle. You could hear a pin drop in there, and then all of a sudden she starts yelling at this guy and throws something across the cubicle, right? Totally immature
Right.
reaction. But I immediately became angry at that, right? And the second,
At the reaction.
yes, and the second I became angry and uncomfortable with that, I noticed that this higher consciousness shut off, right? I no longer had access to it. And so if you are an entity that has any kind of malevolent intent, you won't have access to this, right? You won't have access to that realm, because that is the realm of creation, of creativity. And if you have even the slightest discomfort for creation, or the slightest thought of impurity towards creation, like the thought of anger or something like that, you just won't have access to this. You won't at all, period. All stop. It shuts off. So in other words, you're not fooling anybody, right? If your intentions are malevolent, you're out. You're out of the club. So I just don't buy this idea that there's malevolence there. I think and the thing, to go back to the animal mutilations, well, first let me say this in terms of malevolence, right? Nature isn't always fair. As I said, you know, there are volcanoes that erupt, people's houses burn down, forests burn down, but ultimately at the end of that, what happens is rebirth, right? There's this renewal. And so there are these constant cycles of death and renewing, right? And it's a theme of the universe. And so if you're destroying something in order to give birth to something ultimately that is more creative, then any kind of, you know, bad thing that you do with that end goal in mind, if that is your true intent, then you will continue to have access to that realm, right? But like I said, the second it becomes just destructive and malevolent, you're out. You're done. So that would be my advice to people who think that this is malevolent. I think step back and take a look at nature and understand what's happening to you. That's what I would advise. Animal mutilation, if you want me to talk on that real quick. That, I think, is very complex. There's a Greek myth it's a hymn. It's the Homeric hymn to the god Hermes, right? And it talks about how he had stolen these divine. This god Hermes had stolen these divine cattle from the divine stables, basically. And he slaughters one of them, right? And as he's slaughtering it, he's cooking it as a sacrifice. And he's smelling the meat, you know, and he thinks, and at the same time he's smelling the meat, he thinks, oh, that smells delicious, but I can no longer partake, because this meat can no longer touch my immortal throat. So I won't even go there. But you know, I feel like, so what that story is telling us is it's talking about the beast within, right? This beast that lies within us that you have to kind of kill out. And these are where these malevolent feelings are coming from. And this beast is like all of your fears, your hate, your anger, all of these kind of extroverted emotions that you paint the world with. Those have to go. And that's the beast within, right? And so when he's talking about he can no longer eat and partake of the beast, that's what he's talking about. But it's done in like a mythopoetic kind of form using symbolism, right? And so when we see these mutilated cattle and they have like their eyes cut out and their tongue cut out and their reproductive organs cut out, my kind of thought of that is, and it's almost like they're telling us, these beasts, right? If you see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, then that beast can't reproduce. Does that make sense?
So you don't feed it with your attention and
Yeah.
allow it to propagate.
Right. Yeah. You don't feed it, and it can't reproduce then, right? And it dies. And and so, but people will hear that explanation and they'll think that that's nonsensical. But if you are applying like Jungian psychology to your view of the world, and I have had some success with trying to describe this to people to get them to understand what I'm talking about here. But when you're an extrovert and you're painting the world with all of your internal feelings, right? Then that world becomes like a living myth, right? And so what it's showing you psychologically is that you're painting the world with this myth, right? And so we're showing you what we think you can understand in terms of that myth with this cattle mutilation, right? And the beast within.
Right.
So it's kind of
like the symbols that the sort of archetypical or symbols that sort of that appeal to our consciousness in a way, right? They're not like actual.
Yeah, but there's this whole mythology about it's just they're trying to show us that they're trying to do like scientific research, blah blah blah. Well, you could just take blood for that, or samples, right? You don't need to kill the animal for that. So I feel like that these are much larger demonstrations of something much more abstract than we think they are, if that makes sense. The thing about all of this is I have such a difficult time trying to put this into words. But I talk to other initiated people who know that they've been initiated and understand what this is. And one of those people was he worked for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and she told me about a dream that she had, which I thought was very interesting. There was a male figure in this dream that came to her, and she looks up at him and she says, "Who are you?" And he said, "I am Osiris." And she looks up at him and she's like, "No," she's like, "You're not real. You're just a myth." Right? And he told her then, he said, "We are all of us just living myth." Right? Because when you apply this Jungian psychology to things, you start to see the world very differently. Right? And you can see how instead of chasing the actual real thing that lies in our subconscious, we will reach out and grab and try to pursue symbols of those things in the physical world, right? And in that sense, what we're doing is we're living myth, right? We're living this fantasy that is not the real thing at all. Does that make sense?
Yeah, this is almost like Joseph Campbell territory.
Yeah, and I'm a huge fan of Joseph Campbell and the idea of the hero's journey. I think he's right on about that.
Do you have any personal spiritual practice that you practice? Because, my understanding is that these experiences have not stopped and they're ongoing and they're developing and you're continuing to communicate with these beings. So do you have any spiritual practice like meditation or something that you do every day, or some prayer or something? Or
no, I don't. I never have. But the one thing that I can say that I have always done I know that this is the key to everything, right? A lot of people like to cling to rituals. They meditate over crystals and things like that, but those are just extroverted. You're grabbing at symbols, right? A crystal, for instance, it has the perfect structure to it, right? And so,
Right.
so what you're looking for is that perfect structure, and so you grab a crystal rather than perfecting yourself, right? Right. And so what I try to do is I try to perfect myself every day, all day long. I'm constantly introspecting about symbolism and what are the symbols of the things that are coming to me. What ultimately does that mean? What am I looking for in the subconscious? I started doing this a long time ago when I realized that psychologically I found that I was drawn to people who had like either emotional or professional qualities or mental qualities that I wanted to acquire within myself. And so I thought, well, why don't I just do that? When I see people that I'm drawn to, why don't I just integrate those ideas
Right.
into myself? Because that's ultimately what I'm looking for, right? So I
Right.
had this recognition that I was looking for the real thing, right? That I was looking to cultivate these things within. And
Like what's coming to my mind, sorry, just to interrupt you there, is before I lose the thought, is that all the time people are looking for talismans out there when what you want to be is become one yourself.
yeah,
Become a talisman yourself, right? Become
right.
the source, become the change, and have the sort of the alchemical transformation within yourself,
Yes.
right? I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, sorry, please continue.
Yeah, and you hit the nail right on the head. I mean, so what you're looking for out there is this transformation ultimately. And I can see how people live their lives looking for this transformation, but they're grasping at physical objects, symbols that will represent these things within themselves. And it's sad to see, but it's unfortunately the truth of it. And so that's the way I try to live my life. I look at symbols, I look at things that I am pursuing, and I think about the deeper meaning of those things, and I try to incorporate that in myself. And so I guess that I don't know if that's a spiritual practice anywhere, but I'm sure it's written somewhere. I'm sure of it. But what that's called, I don't know. I guess it's called union, probably psychological integration. Um,
Well, any form of union in Sanskrit is yoga, so it's some kind of yoga to me in an
yeah,
Indic context.
yeah,
And
and those books by William Walker Atkinson, I'm constantly quoting and reading throughout my book. He talks about being an advanced yogi,
right,
and I've never really thought of myself as that, but I guess what I practice, I guess you could probably call some kind of psychological yoga, right?
right,
Um,
right,
I don't know, but yeah,
right, and
I think you're right about that. It makes sense. Thank you for that.
right, and finally, since we're running out of time, the most profound question of all, I think, as we wrap up, how did you land up on Netflix?
Oh, so I think I wound up on Netflix because I think that Diana Pasulka had read my book and she
Right,
she, she liked it, and so she reached out to me. We had some correspondence. She mentions that correspondence in her new book, actually. And so since she was the consultant on that project, she kind of brought me in. And it was a wonderful experience. I met a lot of really just great people doing that. It really was something that I value. quite a bit.
Right.
It was a wonderful experience.
Yeah, it's amazing to find all these little sort of serendipitously bump into all these little connections that all propel you towards the direction that you're supposed to go. So it's amazing how it works.
Yeah.
And I actually wrote down a whole bunch of questions here. I don't think we'll have time to go through all of them. We'll probably need 2 more hours. So we'll have to wrap up today's chat. So thank you so much for trying your best to make it work through the phone. And I really, really thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. And have a wonderful day, and all the best for your next book.
Thank you. I really had a great time with this conversation. Hopefully we can do it again.
Oh yeah. Thanks. Have a great day, Matt, and nice chatting with you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.